All right, so I think it's time to start. Welcome everybody to our distinguished seminar series in CSE, joined with the Applied Math Colloquium this time, and we're delighted to welcome Alex Barnett today in the seminar. Alex is a group leader in numerical analysis at the Flatiron Institute and has also been promoted to a panelist in the Zoom meeting today. So that was quite a setup there. So Alex is one of not only one of my favorite numerical analysts, but is doing my favorite kind of numerical analysis. And you'll see the style, and I invite you to pay attention to that. I think it's a great example for all of us, you know, the way Alex is doing numerical analysis. So his expertise, among others, is in computational electromagnetism and boundary integral equations. And today he's not going to tell us about the high frequency case, but he's going to tell us about the Stokes flow. So thanks for coming, Alex.
Thanks, Laurent. It's great to be back here. I did my PhD down the road at Harvard, and then came in to hang out at MIT Applied Math as I was figuring out how to transition to applied math, and this was one of the reasons I transitioned. So very happy to be applied mathematician. So I'm going to talk about Stokes flows. This is joint work with Anna Brahms, who's now a postdoc, but was a graduate student with Anna Karin Thornburg. And also going to end the talk with some joint work with Daria Malhotra, who's a research scientist with us at CCM. So, okay, so I'll just mention the Flatiron Institute. It's not the Flatiron building. Here's the Flatiron building. Flatiron Institute is this one. It's like 2 blocks south. It's a division of the Simons Foundation. And the Institute has 5 centers. So we're computational math. There's biology, astrophysics, astronomy, quantum physics, and neuroscience. And each has about 50 research staff. And CCM has these different areas. I'm the numerical analysis, if you like, but there's also scientific computing, biophysics and imaging, computational statistics, and machine learning. So those are sort of what's going on there. And one of our main features that's different from academia is that we support software development, so as well as basic research and methods. So as Laurent already mentioned, so I sort of come from, most of my research is in linear PDE in complicated geometries, including wave scattering, but I'm going to talk about fluid flow today. Another line of my work is non-uniform FFTs and signal processing that relates to them. And that includes this software package that is used by groups in MRI and was used for the Event Horizon Telescope for black hole imaging. And then I'm sort of a generalist, so I get sucked into lots of things, including some recently electronic structure and some sort of diffusion problems in biology. And I used to do, and some statistics stuff. So CCM is a sort of a hub for these, like a diversity of problems like this. Okay, so what are we talking about today? So the motivations are studying things like rheology, which is the behavior of a viscous fluid, except what happens if you throw in a whole bunch of solid particles into that fluid? How does that change the viscosity? And when you're dealing with viscous fluids, the inertia of the fluid is negligible, and that's called the 0 Reynolds number limit. So here's an example of an interesting transport question that can occur in a system of rigid spheres being sheared in a viscous fluid, 0 Reynolds number, and the fluid is entrained along the surface of the spheres and has interesting sort of unusual diffusion properties and turbulence and mixing, all at 0 Reynolds number. So how could one model that mathematically? Another example is sedimentation. Here's a simulation of 1,000 spheres sedimenting under gravity, and they're being highlighted when they collide with each other. So this is done by colleagues Wen Yan and in Mike Shelley's group at CCM. These are large computations. This takes like 2 minutes per time step. So you're running this for a day at least on 2,000 cores. So that's the kind of thing I'll that motivates this. In general, there's a bunch of biomechanical problems where viscous fluids are in cells, and there's actin filaments, so high aspect ratio objects. There's solid objects like nuclei, and how does the cell mechanics work? All at 0 Reynolds number. And then there's other motivations coming from swimming objects, like if you have an object with cilia on it, then that has a slip velocity and it can push itself around inside a viscous fluid. And that's the bacteria do this, for instance. Okay, so what I'll talk about is boundary value problems for Stokes, and some of the challenges, method of fundamental solutions to solve them. These two problems, resistance and mobility problem, when you have a lot of objects, then how to deal with spheres when they get close to each other, and then how to deal with slender bodies, including when they get close to each other. So the last part, the middle part is method of fundamental solutions. The last part is boundary integral equations. There's some kind of interplay between those methods. I use both, and they have their different advantages. So, okay, in general, everything that I try and do, and I would say that the philosophy I've really learned from my boss, Leslie Greengard, and one of the reasons I moved to work with Leslie and be part of this center is the goal of designing solvers that are convergent. So what does that mean? It means you write down the model, the PDE model, and you can get arbitrarily small error in solving that model. That they're high order accurate. That means as you try and demand more smaller errors, then that doesn't require that much extra work to make the errors push them down towards 0. And then if the problem grows, like you have 1,000 particles or 10,000 particles, then that should only be 10 times larger computation, right? It scales linearly. Okay, so boundary value problems. So the one you care about in this limit, right? 0 Reynolds number, and this applies to micron-sized particles in water, let's say. The other assumption is there's no Brownian motion. So they're not nanometer-sized particles where they'd be knocked around by thermal motion. So we're going to keep it deterministic. In biology, there's a lot of interest in the Brownian case too, but that's basically another layer on top of what we're going to talk about today. So if you can do this, then you can move on to the Brownian case. So the boundary value problems. We want to solve for the pressure. That's U. P is the pressure field. U is this vector field for the velocity of the fluid. In the exterior of all of these bodies, you have the local force balance, which is the Stokes equations, which I guess includes incompressibility. So the flow, things are going to decay towards infinity, and you apply a boundary condition on the fluid flow. And one boundary condition you might be interested in applying is rigid body motion. If there's no slip, and these are just objects that are going to be rotating and sort of dragging the fluid with them, then, but it doesn't really matter what the boundary condition is. Just you get a unique solution for this. This is a well-posed boundary value problem in any case.
So the boundary,
Yes.
you have the decaying towards infinity. So the boundary is just around this.
Yeah, you take a finite number of bodies, and the exterior of that domain is the solution domain, and it goes up to infinity.
Oh, so boundary is just the surface of these bodies.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So this is the bodies are labeled omega 1 through omega b. That's they are compact sets, and their boundaries are these their boundaries. Okay. So yeah, do ask questions, by the way. Anything's unclear. You're going to need the surface traction. So what this is the force that the fluid applies on these surfaces. And you can just extract that by dotting the stress tensor into the normal vector on the surface. But the point is it's a derived product coming from the derivatives of the solution that you've already gotten. So if you've solved for U and P, then you can now extract the force by integrating the traction over the surface of each body, and you can extract the torque by sort of cross-producting the traction on each body. And so that's an interesting thing you might want to know. And so that leads to the resistance problem, which says, if I'm given the motions, so the rigid body velocities and angular velocities of all of these bodies, what are the forces and torques that result on them? And so that's one big linear system. Yes.
What is Y and CB in the torque?
What's what?
Y and CB that you're integrating for the B torque?
Y is a surface point. So this is ds. Y means a surface element at location Y on the, and right, is that this is sort of standard applied math notation for, or PDE notation. Right?
And the CB?
CB, sorry, is that you have to pick a center point for each body,
Okay.
like a
thank you.
reference point. So it's, yeah. Sorry, I should have explained that. Yes. So you can write this problem as it's a linear map from 6b, a vector of size 6b, which is all of the velocities and angular velocities, to all of the forces and torques. So it's a big matrix. You can call it R. It's the resistance. It's called the grand resistance matrix. There's other variants, which is you could also impose a background flow. Sometimes we'll be doing this. And you could also have slip velocity, like the little spheres or particles all have cilia on them, pushing them around. Okay, so the inverse of the resistance problem is called the mobility problem. That says, I give you all of the forces and torques, and you tell me how all of the particles are going to move. What are their velocities and angular velocities? Formally, it's just the matrix inverse, but you would never compute it that way. Okay, so that's kind of the setup. How are we going to, well, what are the challenges with this? So that's a static solve that's needed every time step if you're going to do a dynamic simulation. And it's in a moving geometry, and everything talks to everything with a long range interaction that dies like 1/r. So that's why that's hard. A more specific reason it's hard is that things get close to each other. So I'm going to show you a movie of a rheology simulation in 2D that I did a few years ago with Jun Wang and Essam Nasok. And what's happening is these rigid ellipses are just being sheared in a fluid, and we're visualizing the pressure you see with the color. So you can start to see when objects are pushing close to each other, there's these near singularities of pressure. And then there's also some particles thrown in to visualize the velocity field. And what you're showing here I mentioned rheology, this is the effective viscosity. It's like how much force you're having to apply to this cell to make it shear like that. And you can see it's dancing around. There's various statistics you could extract from that. So that's the 2D, that's a 2D picture. And you can see these fun force chains forming sort of diagonally, compression and stretching. There's a lot of stuff going on there. In 3D, a picture of what's going on locally is that there's this force density, the traction, and when you have objects getting very close to a separation of delta, the peak in the force becomes 1/delta squared. It's very large. And the width of this peak shrinks like the square root of delta. So that's the nature of the singularity that makes it hard. Okay. So various ways to solve this. Standard finite element is basically never used because you'd have to remesh a horrible exterior domain. You can discretize on a grid, so you don't have to remesh. You have to just deal with cut cells or communication between off-grid points and grid points, and that's usually called immersed boundary or cut cell. These are low-order methods, and if the separation between objects is less than a grid cell, you definitely get the wrong answer because it can't resolve what's going on. So on the other hand, there's Green's function-based methods, so you don't need to discretize the PDE. Instead, you sort of use the formulae for the long-range hydrodynamic interactions between the objects. If they are spheres, this is known, and it's called the RPY tensor, and a lot of chemical engineering community uses this. It's an approximate method. They try to put in lubrication approximations, but to make, I can really only find one paper where this is actually convergent, where you could dial in as many digits accuracy as you want. There's other methods that smooth out singular solutions with using an ad hoc scale. So they don't they're not going to converge to the right answer either. So we're going to talk about boundary integrals in the last part of today, which do converge, and that's using potential theory on the surface. And I guess I mentioned collisions. I'm not going to talk about them today, but they're usually prevented explicitly. And just to give you a flavor of kind of one of the difficulties, the spheres are in the simulation, they collide when they are 1.1 radius apart, or when the separation is 1.1 times what it should be. And then that's to keep them from getting too close, because the PD solver will die if they get too close. So and that means you're definitely getting the wrong answer. So so it'd be nice to at least provide a tool that gets the right answer to the boundary value problems. That's most of the goal today. Okay, so method of fundamental solutions. So this is BIE, boundary integral, was potential theory using the surface as the source. Here you're going to use an off-surface set of sources. So, and this can be convergent and high order, as I'll try and convince you. It's not really used for Stokes much. It should be. So the Stokes PDEs, here's the fundamental solution. This means if I take a little force, a delta function force, and push the fluid from, like the sort of hand of God coming in and just touching that little piece of fluid, you get a resulting flow and pressure field. This is the flow field. It's called the Stokeslet. So we're going to push it at a point Y. So that's called the source point often. And then you're going to observe what it does at some other target point X. And just don't be confused. I'm using sort of the mathematician's language that X and Y are both points in three-dimensional space. So, and they have coordinates X1, X2, X3, right? X and Y are not the two Cartesian coordinates. They're both vectors. So if you're a physicist, please insert R and R prime, and you'll feel happier. Is that okay? Okay. So this thing is great because it solves 3 out of 4 of the things we wanted. It solves the PDE everywhere except at the source point. It's incompressible and it has the right decay. So all you need to do is basically add these guys up in order to get the boundary condition right. Sounds easy. So I'll show it for the sphere, right? Here's what you do is you take these blue dots. They are sources inside the sphere on a slightly smaller sphere with a radius RP. P for proxy, and you can put any quasi-uniform way of putting points on the sphere works. We use spherical design nodes. Anyway, so you make a representation of the flow solution as an unknown sum with a sum with unknown strengths of these sources, and that's it. And you use that the representation outside. And what you're going to do now is take these surface nodes and enforce the boundary value at those surface nodes. It's kind of like the easiest potential theory.
Collocation scheme.
It's called collocation. Yes.
Yeah.
Collocation. So you take surface nodes, you write down the linear system. You're going to have each surface node gives you three rows of the linear system because there's 3 components. And then you can abbreviate this by a big matrix. G hitting the unknown set of source strengths equals the discretization of the boundary data. Okay. Sounds great. If you make this proxy surface well separated on the grid spacing from the surface here, then all of these basis functions that you're using are smooth on the surface, and you can just use the simplest quadrature scheme on the surface. And you need a few more points, so like 1.3, let's say, times the number of source points, and the thing has converged. And this is then a great representation. You can evaluate it right up to the surface and on the surface without any new quadrature schemes. And that's different from boundary integral, where you need quite technical singular quadratures on the surface that I'll show you a little at the end. And even when you're near the surface, you need technical quadratures. Some of my earlier work was on these types of quadrature schemes. However, you can avoid them completely with this fundamental solution method. Okay, so what's the catch? The catch is the conditioning is terrible. This is a ill-conditioned rectangular matrix. So it's formally overdetermined, but it can be in practice underdetermined because of this, because it's rank deficient, right? So basically the condition number is around about 1 over the square root of machine precision often. Why does that happen? Well, so it grows as you throw in more points, then the condition number grows exponentially, root exponentially. And if you want to get small errors, you have to shrink the proxy sphere RP to get a good convergence rate, and that makes the conditioning worse. So to get in, the upshot is to get small errors, you are forced to have a high condition number. And intuitively, what's going on is that there's the matrix is the interaction of the inner sphere with an outer sphere. The mode that decays fastest is the degree root n spherical harmonic. And the decay of that is just, as you all learned in undergrad, the ratio of the radii to the degree. So that's why the net controls the minimum singular value, and that's why it's ill-conditioned. Okay, so this means you can't throw an iterative solver at this, and you need to solve in the least squares sense, and sometimes you need to prevent the solution from being unnecessarily big. So how do you do that? A standard, I mean, for all our work, we deal with each particle being relatively simple, and you can then throw the SVD at it. So at an n cubed cost, you take the SVD, you take the singular values, invert them if they're epsilon times bigger than the largest one. Otherwise, you set them to 0. So this is sometimes called truncated SVD. And that's to prevent the coefficient norm from being unnecessarily large. And then you can stack, you can reverse the order in the SVD and stack with this regularized inverse, and you've built a pseudo inverse. And you should never, so that's called G plus, right? But you should never fill G plus. This isn't something that I've seen well written about. So it'd be nice to, numerical linear algebra should write a little more about this. It's only backward stable if you apply this G plus in the form of 2 matrix vector products. First hit it with UT and then hit it with V sigma plus, for instance. Otherwise you lose digits, so that you shouldn't lose, and it's not backward stable. Okay, that's actually influenced sort of solver design. Anyway, it's one of the things I tend to come up in a lot of my papers. I don't know why. So this is very effective for simple smooth bodies. You have a few thousand unknowns, the SVD takes a few seconds and you're done. So, okay. What does the convergence look like? Well, it's root exponential as well. I'll tell you more about the rate later, but the surface residual converges at one rate. The derived quantities, forces and torques, actually converge a bit faster. And they reach 10 digits by like n big 1700. So this is for 2 spheres that are somewhat close. And we'll understand how the closeness affects the convergence rate in a bit later. So, okay. And you can say, well, how does this compare against boundary integral equations? It's essentially exactly the same number of unknowns. So for spheres, and for boundary integral, if you want to evaluate close, you have to use elaborate vector spherical harmonic sort of reprojection. So it's quite convenient, and it can also handle more general shapes. I'll show you one other shape later. But it can't handle any shape. It's limited by your ability to pick a good set of those proxy sources. So for spheres, it's great. And it's very easy to code. So what happens if you have a lot of spheres? Well, now you have, remember, G was the interaction of the sources to the collocation points. Now it's between one body, B prime, and another body, B. So you have all of those interactions acting on a whole bunch of unknown source strengths, vectors, gives you all of the boundary data. This is huge, it's way too big, and you can't solve it iteratively anyway. It's way too big to even form. So what hope do you have? Well, you can write precondition by solving each body. You can factorize in the way I just described each body individually, and then use that to change bases. That's what right preconditioning means, changing bases. So instead of working with the lambdas strengths, you're going to work with mu's, which represent surface velocity data. And because you can solve one body, you can go from its surface velocity data back to the lambdas. And that's using this one body pseudo inverse. So you precondition the whole thing and you think, great, I should have a well-conditioned matrix, but you don't. Can anyone spot? Well, I actually put it up. I shouldn't go into teaching mode because I put the answer on the screen. Why is this not well conditioned? These diagonal blocks are projectors onto the column space of the one body matrix, but you have more collocation points than unknowns. So in fact, that projector is rank deficient. So that would be a terrible thing to try and do an iterative method on. So you just replace the diagonals by the identity blocks. I hadn't seen this trick done anywhere, but we first did it with my grad student, Larry Liu, back in 2015 in the setting of acoustics. It works really well. So now you have this new matrix G tilde. It's huge, square, and well-conditioned. So now you can iterate on it. Okay, so what do? You have to make a matrix vector multiply for this matrix. It has to be fast because you actually can't fill the thing. So what you do is first, so I'm gonna give you the mat vec. It involves 3 steps. Take the mu's, which for the surface velocities, do the one body solves, which gets you to all of the interior source strengths. And then you've got, and that has to be done with the 2-step procedure. And then you've got all these source strengths. You do a massive all-to-all evaluation of all of the Stokes interactions to all of the surface points. So that's something that you can do in a linear scaling fashion using the fast multipole method. I'm going to highlight 3 pieces of software that all came out of or are maintained by Flatiron Institute. And you basically get a few tens of thousands of points per second per core because it's linear scaling. So you know, to do this all to all. Okay, depending on how many digits you want. Okay, you've done the all to all. You didn't quite get it right. You now have to correct the diagonal blocks for the fact that they became the identity. You could just subtract off the wrong bit and add in the right bit. And you're done. In the end, you do that. Now you use GMRes as a solver with this as the matvec. And then you can, in the end, you have to correct the vector mu back to use step 1 again to get it back to the source strengths. And then use the MFS representation, right? That was the sum of, I forgot to get a pen, but right, it's the sum of the Stokeslets that you can evaluate anywhere. So you can evaluate it anywhere, and then you can get the net torque. Remember the resistance problem, we wanted the forces and torques. You just sum up the strengths that you have, and you sum up their cross products, and you've gotten the forces and torques. So that's kind of the whole procedure for the resistance problem, but which works on large scale problems, right? So now we go to, here's some of the demonstrations from the paper. 2,000 spheres, they're approximately in a layer. You give them all random motions, and you want to know what are the forces and torques that result. What's the sort of drag on all of those spheres? They're not close to each other. They're a quarter of a radius apart at worst. But you only need a few hundred or a couple of thousand degrees of freedom per object. You have to iterate a bunch, but it's a few hours on an old desktop. And I was just discussing with Anna, we need to run computations on a desktop that's newer than 10 years old. But all the results I'm going to show you are on a 10-year-old desktop. So, okay, almost all the cost is the fast multipole method. The number of iterations is sort of problem dependent, which can be annoying. We get 3 digits in the boundary error. Oh, thanks so much. And you get more digits than that in the forces and torques. So, okay, I'll show you another example. This is when we have a background flow. You remember I said there was a U0 that could come in, right? So the MFS representation, I guess I was just going to write this down, right? Flow field at a point X is always just a sum over all of the sources of Stokes-lit kernel. I mean, you can also write this as X minus Y. hitting the source strengths. Right. So this is a tensor hitting a vector and gives you a vector. So, okay, what's going on here? We put spheres 10 to the minus 3 away from each other. And we ran, this time, no motion of the spheres. And we pushed a fluid through it using a background flow, solved the boundary value problem, and we got 4 digits. Any guesses for why we're actually able to get 4 digits with the same coarse discretization of these spheres, even though they're incredibly close to each other? It's a little mysterious to us. So the difference between the previous setup and this one is that the spheres are fixed. So there's no relative motion. And it turns out that then you don't generate one of these lubrication singularities. You only generate it if there's relative motion, like the spheres are coming away and apart. But if you just put them there, fix them like this is like a porous medium, and then push fluid through it, you don't generate singularities. I don't think that's been analyzed in a PD sense. It's sort of known by people, but mathematically it should be studied. Okay, so that's the resistance problem. Now we're going to go to the mobility problem, which is its inverse. And you can't just say, well, fill the matrix and invert it, because you can't even store the matrix. I mean, maybe with 2,000 bodies you could store the matrix, but you don't want to do it that way. So I'm going to sort of represent it. The boundary condition was written as a rigid body motions acting on the 6b tall vector of all of the rigid body motions. So you just write that as a matrix hitting that vector. So Km is a tall matrix that turns, so Km looks like this, and then that is going to hit U. Well, U is 6b, but what this does then is generate the boundary condition data like that. So you then want to extract the forces. Well, that's just actually hitting with a fat matrix, which is basically a transpose of this K matrix. And so now we're sort of turning this into linear algebra more. The mobility, then you can see the linear algebraic structure of that is to solve that G hitting lambda gives you this special form of right-hand side, but with U unknown. But then you've got the K hitting lambda equals F is given. That's a constraint. So you've now got a constrained least squares problem. But what's the linear way to solve that? A linear scaling way. So we don't attack it in this form. What we do is we actually pick a different representation. So this was one of our contributions, is to show how with the method of fundamental solutions you can solve mobility problems. So remember the representation, U equals S lambda. That's what I summarized there. Okay, you set up the orthogonal projector to this, it's the projection onto the column space of this K. So, and then you just need to pick any set of source strengths that gets the right forces and torques. That's actually called a completion flow in the Stokes literature. So let's say just if the force on the sphere is to the right, just take a 1,000th of that force and put it on every single of those sources, and that's your lambda 0. Okay, and then so now you're going to write a representation that takes lambda. So lambda 0, and then you're going to anything else you do to lambda, you want to make sure it has no forces. So you hit it with the orthogonal projector, I minus lambda, I minus L. What that does is make sure that this term produces no net force. And that's true because this Kn transpose hitting this is 0, just by construction. So then the other idea is to say, well, I don't know the rigid body motion either, but I'm just going to make an ansatz that is given by the remaining subspace of lambda that I haven't used yet. So you're kind of you're using both subspaces of lambda. One of them, the one which doesn't produce net forces and torques, you allow to solve the boundary value problem. The one that does, then you allow to represent the rigid body motion. So this is a sort of peculiar thing, because then you've got to move this. U was on the right-hand side, so you now got to move it over to the left-hand side. And now you get this sort of modified linear, modified system matrix, and equals some known junk on the right. Okay, so then you can solve this. It has modified blocks. You can do all of the stuff I just showed about one-body preconditioning, but just using the blocks of this guy instead. And then you can iterate on that and proceed. So let me show you some results for that. Here's ellipsoids, and I'm not going to show you their source points, but they're basically normally displaced just slightly inside the ellipsoid. And here's 10,000 of them. You give them random forces and torques, and you ask what, and here we're plotting what the surface velocities are. Okay, so I'm not, this only takes 7 iterations. Mobility problems iterate much. They have faster convergence rate than resistance problems, and we don't know why. People have observed it, and people haven't been able to do problems of this scale on a single shared memory machine before. Okay, so let's go on to some of the fun about doing the close to touching objects. And so Lord Kelvin, 150 or 170 years ago, wrote down an analytic solution for two charge conducting spheres near each other. It's a sort of brilliant idea. It says, well, the charge of one sphere is just, treat it as a point charge, reflect that to the other sphere, for which there's an analytic formula, keep reflecting it, alternate, and you get an infinite series, and there's an accumulation point for that series. And at some radius called Rac, which is basically 1 minus the square root of the separation. And that tells you where the singularity is. And you could say, can we do that for Stokes? Well, it's more elaborate, because when you reflect a point in another sphere with Stokes, you actually get a whole line singularity down to the origin as well. So you're going to get a huge mess. There's nothing known. Things are not very well known about that. But the concept we need for MFS is that there is an exterior solution. If the data is analytic and the shape and the surface is analytic, then that can be extended analytically as a solution to the PDE somewhat inside the non-physical domain. So down to a smaller sphere than 1, our unit spheres. So that's true for Laplace. We believe it's true for Stokes, but I mean, I don't know a book that goes through the holomorphic theory of Stokes in 3D, but that's what you would need. So so that accumulation point tells you down to what radius can I extend this solution. It turns out from MFS theory in 2D now, and again, it's rigorous in 2D, but it suggests certain things about how we should set up the MFS in 3D. Basically, it says that these singularities should be enclosed by the proxy point curves. And if you do that, then you can get a stable, meaning an order 1 set of strengths. If you don't do that, then the strengths blow up exponentially. They're unstable. And then the convergence rate is, if you do that, the convergence rate is set by this accumulation radius. So that kind of explains these. Remember I showed you a convergence plot? It actually predicts the slopes of these root exponential convergence rates. But the problem is it gets worse and worse. As you bring the spheres closer, the singularities get closer, like the square root of that, and you are forced to use more and more degrees of freedom, and you're dead again. So what do you do? Well, we want to solve multi-sphere reflection problems. So it's kind of curious to think, well, firstly, what happens if you do the multiple image reflections? Well, in 2D, you get something called Indra's pearls. Again, this is old, beautiful, pure math. In 3D, I don't know, you get a fractal dust that lives on some nasty shape. But we didn't want to do that. Well, we said, wouldn't it be nice if the pairwise singularities were enough? So we said, take the proxies, the proxy points, and then enhance them by adding a line that's discretized, a line of unknown strength singularities here that go out to the accumulation points. We don't, and so what we, even, no, the idea that pairwise is enough kind of comes from a paper of Leslie's from the 90s, where they did elaborate pairwise image sums in 2D, and we were like, let's try this with MFS in 3D. So you had to actually use other elaborate types of singularities, or somewhat elaborate. They're just other types of Stokes singularities. And you can see you have to increase the collocation points a little. But the philosophy is be inspired by elaborate analytic formulae, but instead make the computer solve for the coefficients. Don't sit there doing the algebra yourself. That's I've used that approach in a lot of my numerical work. So what happens? Here's a close to touching cluster of a tetrahedron of spheres. Here's the errors if you don't include the images, and then here's the errors if you do include the images. And this is as a function, the x-axis is the separation, and we can go down to 10 to the minus 3 in separation and get 3 digits, which is kind of what we were targeting. We wanted to target 3 digits down to 1,000th of a radius. Particles get rough below that anyway. There's questions about the validity of the model. Right, and you throw in a few extra sources, a few extra terms here, and you're getting like 2 orders of magnitude closer objects for almost for free. So it's not quite for free, because the SVD you have to do has to be done afresh for each sphere, because you've got new unknowns there. But we're trying to work on a way of sort of interpolating that. We'll see. Okay, so here's a larger cluster showing 3-digit accuracy for arbitrary motions, arbitrary forces and torques. And I'd just like to emphasize that Anna ran all of the numerical experiments, wrote all of the code for everything here, and invented all of the we kind of co-invented a lot of the ideas. So okay, so I'm now going to show, and I think the timing's about right for this, in the last 10 minutes or so, the boundary integral part of the talk on a related topic, which is rigid bodies in Stokes flow, both resistance and mobility, but when they are high aspect ratio bodies. So that's something you could not do with method of fundamental solutions. You would, certainly with points, if you take there's a lot of problems with discretizing high aspect ratio bodies. The usual one being that the way surfaces are discretized generally involves order 1 aspect ratio objects or numbers of degrees of freedom. So when this is epsilon and this is 1, then you immediately need 1 over epsilon amount degrees of freedom, and you're kind of dead if epsilon is 10 to the minus 4 or something. So okay, so we're motivated by, well, these are flexible objects, fibers. These are more rigid fibers. Some fibers can be treated as totally rigid. We'd like to do non-rigid eventually, but mathematically the rigid case is simpler, even though we're just seeing all these problems with rigid bodies. Actin filaments, flagellae, cellulose pulps like fibers. So these are sort of some science problems where this comes up. So the standard tool here, developed like, I guess 50 years ago, it's called Slender body theory. It says, I don't want to use the true surface. I just want to discretize a line integral along the center line. And then numerically, people said, oh, well, I can now numerically discretize that line integral, and we're sailing, right? Problem is, so it does have classically, it has an ignored term, which is epsilon squared log something. It's very hard to do rigorous analysis on this. And Laurel Ohm has been one of the people pushing this. You can do numerical experiments. So this is one of the ones we can do with using a high accuracy tool, is say, push two slender objects together by separation of delta. How good is slender body theory at getting that right? And it turns out it's inaccurate whenever epsilon itself is big. So that's to the right of this diagram, because we're plotting the log to the base 10 of epsilon here. The right-hand side is 10 to the minus 1, so a tenth. Everything is wrong, basically, there. And then the other axis is how close they are. So when you're 1 radius away, it's also completely wrong. If you're 10 radii away, you can get like 2 digits, 3 if you're lucky. So that's the problem with slender body theory. So that's the motivation, is to replace something with a high order accurate boundary integral method that doesn't scale, like it doesn't increase its cost as epsilon goes to 0, as you shrink the radius. So like the user can dial in 0.1 or 10 to the minus 5, and then they say completely independently, oh, I would like 3 digits or 6 digits on that. And that's something you can't do with slender body theory because the accuracy is always tied to epsilon. If epsilon is 0.1, you get the accuracy you get, and you're never going to do any better. So that's the concept of a convergent scheme. So this is just going to be a sketch, as I said, for this stuff. We had to invent new layer potential representations. So what does this mean? S is now called a single layer operator. It's basically it's a continuous distribution of these Stokes-lit sources on the true surface. D is something called a double layer, which is a continuous distribution of kind of derivatives of those point sources, essentially. And then you mix these guys together, and we had to invent a new mixing factor that scales with epsilon so that the thing came out well conditioned. And we also then had to do some of this projector stuff, this I minus L orthogonal projectors to get, and no one has sort of considered this problem in this limit of small radius. So we then discretize the surface. Okay, we're discretizing it with Chebyshev panels adaptively if they get close to something. So that's done through geometry sensing, like, am I close to something else? And then you give a fixed number of Fourier modes per panel. And that can change as well. So if you zoom in here, there's actually more Fourier modes in these panels here. And so it's a kind of product quadrature scheme. And then you're going to apply these. You've got your second kind operator. If you take this and restrict it to the surface and use the jump relations, which I don't have time to go into, you get an identity plus compact operator. And then when you discretize that, you get a well-conditioned square linear system. So that's boundary integral universe. There are some of the technical stuff we had to solve, and this was, I kind of gave an overview. Daria did all of the work here, is that you have to handle these weakly singular operators. So here's a target point, and you want to evaluate an integral on this surface that passes through that target point. In the outer quadrature, you end up with some log singularities, so you need dyadic refinement. But then what Daria did, was sort of genius, is to say, I'm going to generate custom quadrature rules that replace all of those refined panels by 4D quadrature points. And the same happened in the theta direction, right? It's kind of going around we're limited to fibers with a circular cross section, because then you get certain fast lookup tables for the evaluating the theta integrals. All of this uses this technology, generalized Chebyshev quadrature, which comes out of Vladimir Rocklin's group, and where you get to say, I have a family of functions, maybe they're singular, they have weirdnesses like logs in them. Please give me a set of custom nodes and weights that are the most efficient possible for integrating that family, every guy in that family of functions, every linear combination, of course, of those functions. So that's a useful tool for speeding these things up. Okay, we can get 10 digits of accuracy down to close separations, right? I showed you the response time of Zoom is long, but like this separation here is like a 20th of epsilon. So, okay. And Daria did an amazing HPC implementation that uses all of the tools that he's done over the years, including SIMD optimized kernels for close evaluations. And then the far field is all put into his FMM called PVFMM, which is MPI. And so the setup rate is fast, right? You can kind of handle 20,000 quadrature point calculations per second per core. Okay, and now I'll just show you a little result on this, and a large-scale sedimentation result. So finally, we're going to step into the time domain and say, okay, at any static configuration, you give me the forces and torques, I'll tell you the velocities. Now update the configuration using those velocities. So X is the vector of all of the locations and rotations of all of the objects. You solve the mobility problem at that configuration X. Here, we're saying we're going to apply gravity to all the objects. There's no inertia. You're in the extreme. Yeah, we're going to assume the objects are light enough that they don't have inertia, but you could have a second order ODE if you wanted to. And then you use that to update in an ODE, in a big system of ODEs, all of the locations of the objects. So I guess I should just hit that. Okay, and you get to see the time steps if I move the cursor out of the way. And you can see this is gravity falling. I'll do that again. I sped it up just for it to go fast. The colors actually are showing the surface velocity. So you can see there's a sort of plume of in the middle of a collection of objects. The average density is higher, so it just sort of pushes down through the rest. The outer stuff then is getting dragged against the static fluid that's around the side. So that's why it actually gets pulled up, right? These ones sometimes even go up. So, but, and then there's a sort of train of objects left, like a little, if you look at the Yan 2020 paper, there's some beautiful pictures of little chains of spheres left, sort of a dribble of them left behind the path. So, okay, so Daria did, used spectral deferred correction for the time stepping. That means every time step, you have to do multiple GMRes solves and sweep through however many orders as well. Preconditioning is applied to each body, which just helps a little bit, not much. There's about sort of, 1.6 million unknowns, 7-digit accuracy, which is sort of unprecedented on any Stokes simulations at this scale. And it takes about a day, and it's sort of on I don't know, it distributes to 160 cores is only like, I don't know, 8 machines or something these days. So, okay, and this is all a header-only library that Daria built. And my job in this project was just to code up Slender body theory so we could do the comparisons and to prove some of the theorems that prove that representation that I showed you before is unique. That it's that operator is injective, that kind of thing. So, okay.
So how different are the answers do you get from Slender body theory?
Well, we didn't run that simulation on Slender body theory. What we did is a bunch of static solves. And in particular, this case of 2 toruses coming close. And that graph is the best answer to that I can give. A guy called Mitchell, who was also in a paper with Laurel Ohm and Daniel Spern and that crew. Oh, hang on. Which way do I want to go? Back here, this picture, right? So this is the relative error of the forces if you prescribe the motions for 2 objects.
But I'm just wondering, at a global level, of course, the Slender body theory is going to break down.
Yes.
In some cases. The question is if those cases only arise occasionally, maybe
Yes.
like globally, it only changes the answer by
Right.
1%.
It depends on density. And we can't address that problem properly yet because we don't have collision resolution built in. So basically, Daria stops the simulation when 2 objects touch. Well, they never really touch, but the mathematical problem says they're going to get exponentially close very fast because they have high curvatures. So then you'd have to put collision resolution in. So all I know is the work from chemical engineering that has a lot they try and get the rheology right for high density simulations, and essentially every particle is near somebody. So you couldn't apply it at any point. Now people do simulations like Anna Karen and Mike Shelley, like 20 years ago, did some rigid sedimenting short fibers and used Slender body theory, and got some results there. And if they're not too close to each other, then you're getting the right answer. But you can't bring fibers close to each other. And biologically this happens, but there is a gap between the math problem, which is what I work on, and the biology, where there's a whole bunch of messy goo in a cell with things getting tangled, and the steric interactions that make the things stick to each other anyway. So it's very problem dependent. That's all I say. But yes, a hybrid scheme might be good. But the thing is, I don't think you're going to win because this is fast enough that it won't discretize. For the parts of the geometry that are far away, it'll just use a couple of big panels and a couple of Fourier modes. And it's essentially the cost of Slender body theory anyway. So you're not going to win much by doing that. And this way we know it's convergent. So Maybe that's a better response. All right, so I'll finish up with this conclusion slide. Oh, yeah, so I've shown you some, all right, linear cost, meaning linear in the problem size, cost solvers for Stokes flows with lots of simple particles. Using MFS, it's hard to get things right when things get close, lubrication. And then, but we did this image line idea. And then high aspect ratio fibers, boundary integrals is the right way to go for that instead. And we had to invent a whole bunch of stuff to get that to work. But the idea is that it should replace slender body theory in numerical simulations. It should just be a drop-in replacement that's no slower, but you can dial in the accuracy you want. I hope to continue that. Here's the papers, and here's Daria's header-only library code base, which you should try out because he's written some examples for it. And it's all sort of object-oriented. There's plenty of things to do. I don't know how many of these things to get involved in, but Anna is definitely heading into the Brownian direction, which says now you're going to solve a stochastic differential equation for that x variable, where the velocities are updated not only by the deterministic part, but by sampling a covariance, a big Gaussian covariance matrix, or a big vector whose covariance matrix is the mobility matrix. So you have to be able to sample from that. And then there's collision handling and a bunch of other things. These solvers could be dropped into existing collision handling codes, and that's the idea. So thanks to Leslie Greengard, Mike Shelley, Chauvin, and June for also good discussions on this stuff. Thanks a lot.
Right, so let's have a very short Q&A. We have a Zoom portion to this, but we're not seeing, I don't see the chat. So if anybody on Zoom has a burning question, please voice, your question.
Do you have anything preliminary to say about the two-body preconditioning for closed particles?
Glad you asked, and I'm glad I decided to make that an extra slide. Yes. And that was not a setup. Didn't know. Yeah, I had mentioned this word two-body preconditioning. Okay. The idea is the GM-res iterations, as they get closer, are growing really badly for the resistance problem. You have 1,000 GM-res iterations. Okay, if you are willing to solve two-body problems directly instead of one-body problems, you're kind of building like a hybrid solver where the inner solver is the direct solver, and then the outer one iterates, and you recompress, you sort of compress the degrees of freedom that you solve the inner problem so that they just appear to be a coarse set of degrees of freedom to the outer solver. Then it works well. And that was an idea I had, and Anna has coded it up. The algebra was kind of a mess, but I just handed it all over and she did it. And you could see that the GM-res iterations comes down to essentially constant with its separation. Now, it's not like completely solved, because if you have a triangle of objects, then for some reason we seem to see about one extra GM-res iteration per triangle of objects that appears in the cluster in 2D. That could be because of fluid trapping in 2D. And as you may realize, that spheres are not able to trap fluid in 3D in the way that disks can in 2D. So we don't know. That's all open. But yes, this comes from me trying to understand Leslie's paper and realize that a good way to rephrase it is that you should solve a little local boundary value problem, use that to make some basis functions, and then kind of forget them and just like write down the matrix on the coarse unknowns that that represents that correct close two-body solution. That's clear. But anyway, it's working, and we're working on it. But right, it requires you to solve lots of problems with different distances, but we have ways to deal with that too. We're trying, and Dan Fortunato is working on this with Daria as well. It's all very confusing down the corridor. So we have two competing groups on the same floor.
They're working on 3D or 2D?
2D.
Oh.
So, so anyway, yes. Thanks for asking.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, let's keep our questions for just, just after offline. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Alex.